MCU has seen some huge villains in the past. Thanos, Loki, Baskin-Robbins, Sony executives. But there's one dastardly villain who's the true cause of almost every single bad thing in the entire franchise. It's Tony Stark. Yep, that's right, CBR Saga viewers. Iron Man himself is the biggest bad in the MCU, hands down. And okay, yes, I know he's also one of the biggest heroes and sacrificed himself to save the universe and did a lot of great things too, yada yada yada, but that doesn't mean he can't still be a villain. Don't believe me? Well, join us today as we discuss how his choices led to almost every villain he's ever faced, how his actions affected the MCU in negative ways on top of the positives, and how even though he's in that iron scrapyard in the sky, how he'll continue to be the biggest villain from beyond the grave. It's going to be a fun episode, and I hope you all don't get too mad at us. I'm joined by my co-host, Nick. Nick, how you doing today?
I'm doing good, Jacoby. Why would anyone get mad at us for saying that Tony Stark's a villain? What are you talking about?
Yeah, I wonder why they would do that at all. It's not like Tony Stark is like a hero and done a lot of good things. And we're not saying that, right? I fully understand that he is probably the greatest hero, one of the greatest heroes of the MCU. He's just also a villain, and that will make more sense as we go on. But what do you think?
Talking about Tony Stark not as a traditional villain, obviously, but in a sense that he is often the cause or the linchpin for a lot of the antagonistic characters or events that happen in the MCU, and it's kind of overwhelming how many there actually are when you really stop and think about it.
Exactly, because it is a lot. It is a consistent pattern, and you think they would have learned by now, to not go that route. But if we even trace his kind of history, because some of them are more his fault, but even in his earlier days, it's we can discuss whether or not we can really blame him, because going back to the very first Iron Man, he wasn't really Iron Man yet. He was still billionaire, not philanthropist, playboy genius, right? He didn't have that good in him. Of course, he was a little cocky, a little arrogant, and that's what kind of caused Ironmonger, Obadiah Stane, to be like, hey, this kid should not be running everything. It's I kind of want to run things. That one's an understandable creation, right? Maybe.
No, totally. You're right. He is in that very, haven't learned my lesson yet moment, especially before he goes into the cave and becomes Iron Man. But he's sort of, obviously, it's Stane's fault for being a jerk, but Tony definitely created the circumstances that made Stane feel inadequate in the sense that he knows he's better for the job because he's built the company from nothing, and yet it still goes to this punk kid who walks and talks like he's better than everyone else.
Yeah, so if Tony Stark wasn't the punk kid as he's kind of described as, do you think Obadiah Stane would have been the nice Jeff Bridges-esque person that he could have been?
No. Because part of me thinks what would have happened if Howard Stark had lived? Would him and Stane have been friends, or would Howard have had to one day fight Stane? There's a real evil in Stane, and you can really see it when he goes to see Raza in the Ten Rings to actually get the suit that Tony left behind. There's a real evil in this guy, so I think it would have come out eventually, but Tony's behavior as a young person who took over Stark Industries definitely let it out faster.
He may not have been the true catalyst, but he certainly didn't help things, and he really just kind of made things a lot worse. But a lot of it, you can forgive him. It's his first movie. It's past Tony, right? And I think that kind of leads over to the second one as well. But is it just his attitude? Is Tony Stark's general attitude that really infuriates people like Justin Hammer to be I want to create more, I want to create good things, and you're kind of a dick who humiliates me, and now I want to build better things. Do you think his attitude in Iron Man 2 kind of led the way to more villains?
Yes, I agree that Tony's attitude and behavior, it makes you dislike him if you are a competitor with him. He doesn't make it easy to lose to him. And there's a quote in Captain America Civil War that I think applies to all the villains we're going to talk about, but it especially applies to the situation with Justin Hammer and Ivan Vanko. And the quote is from Vision, and they're talking about the Sokovia Accords, and he's since Tony announced himself as Iron Man, the amount of villains basically has risen at an exponential rate. And he basically says,
our very strength invites invites challenge. Challenge incites conflict.
So I think Tony's very nature of being a person who pushes technology, who created weapons for the army, it invites the challenge of Justin Hammer. It invites the challenge of Ivan Vanko, who, if anything, just want to be better than Tony, and they're willing to like take shortcuts and do bad things to be better than Tony, and that's what makes them villains.
I've always loved that quote too. I think it's like one of my favorite quotes from Civil War. One, because it's a good quote, but two, it also kind of makes it easier to explain. There are more villains because there are more movies. Like that's like on a behind the scenes basis, but like the way that they work that in, it's like our very nature invokes conflict. Really it was just a really neat way to handle that. But I agree, even though in Iron Man 2 like itself, like sure, Whiplash hated Tony Stark, but how much do you compare Whiplash's hate toward Tony compared to the sins of Tony's father?
It was definitely kickstarted by Tony's father, but also some could say it was kickstarted by Ivan Vanko's father. You know, no one's really there. No one really knows what happened. Like apparently Anton Vanko did some bad stuff. So like, was Howard Stark really in the wrong? The point is that Tony, again in his attitude and his sort of behavior, continued his father's legacy in a very arrogant way, to a point where if Ivan Vanko already has it out for the Starks, Tony is not helping.
You see him like, oh, he wants to hop in and be like a race car driver in like Monaco. It's like, man, I want to beat this guy up. Like, it's kind of like... And then I think it's very interesting that the series kind of, they introduced that idea in Iron Man 2, but then in Iron Man 3, they went back and they kind of regressed and showed that the villain of that movie was solely created back in Tony's jerk days, right? When he was like, when he was a not nice person. And then they gave another villain who was caused by Tony's recklessness in the past and had him pay for the sins of who he was before and try to get over them. Do you think that was like, I'm always torn about that direction, I guess. It's like, because I get that as a end of a trilogy, you know, you kind of want to have your character reflect on the past from like how far he's come, because I think it makes sense, but also it's like we'd already seen that kind of before, and I'm always torn on how effective it was. What are your thoughts on it?
Sure, yeah. I'm not head over heels in love with Iron Man 3. I think it's a good movie. The villain is a little weak, and maybe that's the reason, is because they chose to sort of regress in time like that and do something we had sort of already seen before. But I also do like the idea of Tony being faced by this past that he thinks he can spend time in a cave and go fight in New York, in that everything's suddenly forgiven. So I do kind of like that aspect. I just don't know that it was executed super well. But it's funny because Tony essentially is learning the Spider-Man lesson of,
with great power comes great responsibility.
over and over and over again, because he just doesn't learn it. Even if we go back to Iron Man 2, like the suit falls in Justin Hammer's hands because he decides to get drunk in it and Rhodey takes it. And then if we look in Iron Man 3, it's like being a jerk in 1999 in a New Year's party and telling some guy to wait for you on the roof and then not going. Look at the effects that can have. So Tony really needs the responsibility talk from Uncle Ben.
Wow, now that I think about it, I think you're absolutely right. There really aren't a lot of moments in Tony's movies where he has to like really reckon with who he was. Like they gloss over that in a lot of ways. Like sure, there's a Dark Knight of the Soul moment where he's like either afraid he's going to die or that he can't do it, but it's never a thing of my actions have caused this. Like what am I going to do about it and how am I going to be better? And you're right, that has led to just the same thing happening because Tony doesn't learn. Where is Uncle Ben when we need him?
I will say they definitely make it a point to say that he is trying to learn later on as we get into the movies, but especially if we're just talking about the phase 1 up to Iron Man 3, he definitely hasn't learned that lesson yet.
Maybe I could forgive the fact that Tony created his own villains, because in a way, and for a superhero film, that's what kind of makes them interesting, right? Like a superhero's mistake is what leads to the villains. But Tony's going around creating other heroes' villains too, like all of them. So it's like, and that's where it gets a little questionable in terms of how much of a hero Tony Stark can be when he's creating like all of Spider-Man's villains. I mean, if we start with the Vulture, obviously it's like Vulture was a character, just a working class dude who was trying to do his job, and then Tony Stark tried to swoop in without thinking about the little guy and wanted to, handle the damage, the cleanup. And sure, that probably in Tony's mind that was the great thing to do, but he looked over the people who would really suffer from this, and then of course that created the Vulture, right?
Right. Yeah, no, there are moments where Tony tries to learn, because he does these things that honestly are good natured. He's like, the Avengers just made a mess of New York, like I'm going to pay to clean it up.
Yeah.
But he doesn't have that follow through. He doesn't have the responsibility to think out his actions fully, because he doesn't think of the little guy, and now his technology is in the hands of this person willing to do bad with it.
Exactly. And then it forces, Spider-Man to kind of step up and save the day. And then that concept of its technology is in the hands of someone who would do bad with it kind of leads into the next villain, Spider-Man Far From Home, which had Quentin Beck, aka Mysterio, who turned out to be another person who was mad at Tony Stark for something he did in his past. And I think this one's actually pretty interesting because I think on the surface, you could maybe write off the fact that, yeah, he was a little wrong in terms of his methods of how to go about it. But like when he presents his story of just like, this was my life's work, I created it for him, and then Tony turned around and named it Barf and fired me. That's like understandable to be upset about. And yes, you get that sense that Beck was probably a little unstable. I think you have to be if you end up doing what Beck does. But then the movie also doubles down on the fact that it's not just Beck operating. It's like literally like all former Tony Stark employees who are mad about what he did. Like if it's just Beck on his own, it's like maybe that's an isolated case. But the fact that it's like all of them, you think that, okay, maybe these guys like actually have a point.
Maybe Stark Industries needed a better HR department or something, because
or something.
They literally formed the Tony Stark Hate Club, and that is who the villain Mysterio is. It's not just Quentin Beck. He's the face of it, but it's literally like all of Tony's former scorned employees who are clearly willing to do bad based on how their boss treated them. So, yes, while Tony has pitched us as this big hero, he clearly wasn't doing everything right behind the scenes, especially not even just the wrong things that we were shown. There were things that we weren't shown.
Exactly, because if you're an everyday person, like what does your boss have to do to be that bad for you to like resort to like a full-on life of crime, of like fool the whole world type thing? Like Tony Stark must have been awful to work for, right? Like they all can't have been evil to their core.
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, Beck does turn into this sort of unhinged psychopath by the end of it, but on paper, the story that you said makes sense. His life's work treated like a joke, and then Tony basically slapped him in the face and said bye.
Yeah. See, and again, it's just like it reiterates our point that's like, yeah, Tony Stark is a hero, but just his kind of careless actions and his inability to kind of think of the consequences that he's causing has caused some big ripples. Do you think that's, as a behind the scenes question, do you think that that's poor writing, or do you think that's an essential part of Tony Stark's character where it's kind of necessary that he keeps overlooking things type thing?
I think it's actually incredible writing. I think it could be poor writing, but I think it's who Tony Stark is as a character, is someone. And this is really important, especially when you talk about things that happen in maybe Age of Ultron or Civil War. But he is the type of person to trust himself so innately, because he is one of the smartest people in the world, that he doesn't have to think twice about his decisions. He literally says, okay, this is what's right. I've thought it up, so it must be right. We're doing it. And that leads to Ultron. That leads to the Sokovia Accords. It leads to a lot of bad stuff.
Great points, Max. That kind of moves into our next point about Ultron and Civil War, where it plays into exactly what you just said. It's like he absolutely 100% thinks he's right and wants to do the right thing. And because the movies are framed around him, it's just like we kind of believe it too. Like, yes, he created Ultron, but he did it because he wants to protect the world from like the big one. And yeah, that's normally that could be a very hero's reasoning before that. But if you look at any other movie where you have that sort of character who only wants to protect the world from itself by creating this big thing or this event or whatever it is, they're usually the bad guys of the movie, right? It's like they're not the heroes fighting against it. So the fact that the way that they're able to frame it, I guess, and show Tony Stark to have it both ways, I guess I agree with you that it is good writing in terms of how they balance Tony's kind of maybe poor decision making coupled with the fact that he is a hero who will save the day at the end. And I think that balance has been pretty cool.
Right, because it's a great balance, because it's not only that he created Ultron, but he also created Vision. So for every Ultron comes a Vision, if we're going to use that as a direct metaphor. Tony's movies are all about him cleaning up after the mistakes he's made. He just always tends to make them again because he trusts himself so innately to not think twice about his decisions.
That's true. And then that kind of leads us to, I think, the most interesting Tony dilemma that I think we've seen in the MCU, at least personally. It's like Captain America Civil War, which I think is one of my favorite MCU movies just because of the way that, yes, I don't really agree with Tony, but it's like on some level I do, because like the way that they present it is just like, I absolutely understand after everything he's seen why he's going about this the way he is. When you watch the movie, were you Team Cap or Team Iron Man?
I was Team Cap, but the reason Civil War is my favorite MCU movie is because they do such a great job of making you realize why both the characters are on the sides that they're on. And Cap has every reason to, based on his trust of government entities and oversight, and how that didn't go well in his last movie. And Tony has, for extremely different reasons, but he's just as justified in saying we need oversight. Even this is him trying to it's so ironic because this is him trying to say for the first time, hey, I'm not the person that should decide things. But that in itself is a decision that he didn't give a whole lot of thought to. So I was very much Team Cap because I thought Tony was just like, well, I did a bad thing, so this is the solution.
You can also tell he didn't put like a lot of thought into it because, yeah, he is completely totally like, yeah, I should not be making these decisions about who goes where and does all these things. Like, I'm on board with that. Oh, I gotta go fight Cap. Let me go to New York and pick up a 15-year-old without telling anybody to fight, to fight with me.
Right.
And that's like goes against everything what kind of the Sokovia Accords kind of seemed about in the first place to me. You could call that like a plot hole of some sort, but it does make sense for Tony's character of just, I agree with the idea of it, but I just don't know how to execute it, and I'm so blinded by what I think is right that I'm going to do whatever regardless. And that, if you say that out loud, that makes a dangerous villain, doesn't it? If Tony Stark was a full-on bad guy in this way of thinking, he'd be almost unstoppable. Because he's so genius and he's so committed to his beliefs and his values that he'll never be swayed. Like, he'll always believe what he's doing is right. So I guess we're kind of lucky we got the Tony Stark that we got.
You're right, because that sentence, that general phrase of being so confident that you are right, I literally just quoted Thanos just by saying that. That's literally something Thanos, like, has to feel so desperately that you're right, and to have it fail all the same. Like, Thanos is a person whose mind is set on his goal and no one can change his mind. So like we've said in past podcasts, like, heroes and villains are so similar. It's just tiny different choices that they make that make them a hero or a villain. But you're right, Tony Stark has a lot of similarities with the biggest villains we've seen in the MCU.
And that's why I always thought it would be so interesting. I know that they really can't, because I bet Robert Downey Jr. is done. Like, he went out on a high note. He doesn't want to come back. But the idea of, in this multiverse universe that we're kind of creating, like, there's an evil Tony Stark out there and he's protecting his world and he's like our Tony except evil, would be fascinating to see, like, played out, just to see how different our Tony could have been and how similar an evil Tony is to a good Tony, and just how great that would be. I doubt we'd ever get that, but that is my pipe dream.
I could see it as like a what if episode.
Oh yeah, animate that. Robert Downey Jr. will definitely come back for an animated episode.
I'd be down to watch that.
What we know about the MCU going forward, there's a theory that I kind of like that kind of shows Iron Man's influence moving forward from Beyond the Grave, and it's the fact of going into Black Widow's movie, Taskmaster. He is another villain who looks like he can mimic powers, and like the technology that he has, there's a rumor going out there that like the mask where he can mimic is like the mask that Tony left behind after Civil War. After that scene of where Tony's like,
where he analyzes Cap's fight pattern, that kind of thing.
Yeah, to get it locked down so he knows exactly what to do. A thing that we've never like really seen before and haven't really seen since. And the fact that it's there and he leaves some of that suit behind in Civil War, has made some people think that, yeah, he could cause Taskmaster. And what I think is interesting is, even if that turns out to be true or not, it's the possibility of it, just the fact that we're talking about it and that it could be a possibility is just very telling of Tony's character. That's the takeaway I get from that. But what do you think of that theory overall?
I like the theory overall, especially the idea of Tony having a hand in characters that are still created. He has a hand in so many characters when you think about it. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, he had a hand in their creation essentially, when his weapons killed their parents. He has influences on people who use his technology even when he doesn't even know who they are. So I think it'd be really interesting to say, not even if Taskmaster is someone who knew Tony Stark and it was scorned by Tony Stark, because that would start to feel a little repetitive. But the idea that Tony Stark has a hand in yet another villain because his technology was out there and he did not do the responsible thing of making sure it didn't fall into the wrong hands could be a really interesting way to set up this new villain.
And also leads into what would be a great wrap up to this whole idea of Tony Stark being a villain, I think, is Armor Wars, which we were told is the log line of Tony's tech falling into the wrong hands, and it's kind of Rhodey's show. You know, Rhodey is the star of it going forward. But Iron Man 2 told a very similar story to that, but it was hard for us to look at it objectively because Tony Stark was in it, right? Like he was in it and we automatically rooted for him. Now in Armor Wars, where we can assess Tony's impact on the world and this MCU overall and like what his tech does for both good and bad people without him making funny quips and making us like him, I think is going to be fascinating. Like, and I really do not know at the end of it if I'm going to think of Tony Stark as more of a hero who is necessary for everything he does, or more of a villain. What do you think?
Well, it's like that line again. It's our very nature invites challenge. The things that Tony created for good or for bad invites challenge. When light rises, dark rises to meet it, or dark rises, light rises to meet it. It's a very philosophical thing, and I think it's something really cool that will continue on in the MCU. It's really hard not to see Tony Stark as a hero. The dude sacrificed his life to save literally half of the universe.
Yeah.
So it's almost like he's got a free pass for the rest of whatever happens in the MCU. But the idea of his sort of past actions, of his creations, his weapons, his technology, having ramifications beyond what he intended, I still think is a really unique, interesting concept that can be explored further in the MCU, especially how it affects characters, because we've seen how it's affected Spider-Man, and it's made Spider-Man a really great character. So to see it do the same thing for Rhodey, to further Rhodey's story in the sense that he now has to deal with Tony Stark's mistakes, that's something I'm really excited to see.
Overall, there's just a lot to think about in terms of Tony Stark being a villain, because I think I went into this kind of thinking that, yeah, he's definitely a villain, and I'm coming out of this as like, yeah, he's definitely a villain, but he's also one of the greatest heroes ever. And at the end of the day, it's what makes the MCU better, that it gives us characters like that. I wonder what you guys think. If you guys can see Tony Stark as a villain, what other future actions is he going to cause for this MCU? You know, and will that sort of help his spirit live on in a way? This episode has left me a lot to think about. So thank you very much, Nick, for joining me, and thank all of you, and we'll see you next time.